Marcus Chen stared at the acceptance letter in his hands, still unable to believe it was real. At 17, he was the youngest human ever selected for the Galactic exchange program. While his classmates worried about prom dates and college applications, Marcus would be spending his senior year aboard Kepler Station, studying alongside alien species from across the galaxy. The shuttle ride to the massive space station took 3 days. Marcus pressed his face against the viewport, watching Earth shrink to a blue marble, then disappear entirely. The other human students on board were all college-aged or older. They treated him like a curious little brother, which made Marcus feel even more out of place. Kepler Station was enormous, a gleaming metal city floating in the void between star systems. As their shuttle docked, Marcus could see dozens of other ships of wildly different designs. Some looked like crystalline flowers, others resembled massive insects, and a few defied any earthly comparison entirely. The orientation hall buzzed with alien languages that Marcus's universal translator struggled to process. He found himself seated between a tall, blue-skinned Valdorian, whose gills fluttered nervously, and a small, furry creature called a Zimek who kept chattering excitedly in high-pitched squeaks. Director Koth, a distinguished Centaurian with 4 arms and kind golden eyes, welcomed the new students. "You represent 47 different species from across our galaxy," she announced. "Here you will learn not just science and mathematics, but the art of cooperation between vastly different forms of life." Marcus's first few weeks were overwhelming. The station operated on a 28-hour cycle that left him constantly tired. The food synthesizers produced meals that barely resembled anything from Earth, and some of his classmates communicated through color changes or electromagnetic pulses rather than speech. But Marcus had always been adaptable. While other students formed groups with their own species, he made friends across the biological spectrum. He helped Zara, a crystalline silicate, understand human humor. He learned to play quantum chess with Thok, a massive Ursoid whose claws could crush steel but who was surprisingly gentle. He even figured out how to communicate with the photonic beings who existed as pure energy. His favorite class was xenobiology, taught by Dr. Veltar, an ancient Aquarian whose tentacles could perform complex calculations while she spoke. The class studied different forms of life and how they evolved to survive in various environments. Marcus found himself fascinated by the incredible diversity of survival strategies across the galaxy. Everything changed during his 6th week at the station. Marcus was walking through the observation deck after dinner when he noticed unusual activity near the docking bays. Security personnel were rushing back and forth, and several ships were departing in obvious haste. He found Zara near the main viewport, her crystalline body flickering with worried patterns of light. "Something terrible has happened," she chimed, her voice like wind through crystal caves. "A ship arrived an hour ago carrying refugees. They're the last survivors of their species." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "The last survivors? What happened to the others?" "Disease," whispered Thok, approaching on silent paws despite his massive size. The Kethmori homeworld was infected by something that spread faster than they could contain. Their entire population of 12 billion died within days. Only a few hundred escaped. The 3 friends stood in stunned silence, watching as medical shuttles ferried the survivors to the station's hospital wing. Marcus had learned about extinct species in his classes, but those were always ancient history. The idea that an entire civilization could vanish in mere days was terrifying. Over the next few days, news about the Kethmori tragedy spread throughout the station. The survivors were in quarantine, both for their own protection and to prevent the disease from spreading further. The station's medical staff, led by Dr. Nithera, worked around the clock to understand what had happened and whether the remaining Kethmori could be saved. Marcus found himself unable to concentrate on his studies. During xenobiology class, he kept thinking about the survivors trapped in the medical bay. Dr. Veltar noticed his distraction and called on him to answer a question about adaptive immunity. "I'm sorry, Dr. Veltar," Marcus said. "I was thinking about the Kethmori. Is there really nothing that can be done for them?" The ancient Aquarian's tentacles rippled thoughtfully. "The disease that killed their species appears to be unlike anything we have encountered before. It targets their specific genetic structure, making their immune systems turn against their own bodies. Dr. Nithara's team has been working without rest, but they have made little progress. But surely someone in the galaxy has faced something similar before." Marcus pressed. With all the different species and all the different diseases, there must be some kind of solution. Dr. Veltar's large eyes studied Marcus carefully. You raise an interesting point, young human. Perhaps the answer lies not in finding a perfect match, but in understanding how different species have overcome similar challenges through convergent evolution. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what Dr. Veltar had said about convergent evolution, the way different species independently developed similar solutions to survival problems. Earth had countless examples. Dolphins and sharks both evolved streamlined bodies for swimming, despite being completely unrelated. Birds and bats both developed wings, though they came from different evolutionary paths. He found himself wondering if the same principle might apply to disease resistance. Maybe somewhere in the galaxy, a species had faced a similar genetic attack and found a way to survive. The solution might not be a direct cure, but rather a completely different approach that achieved the same result. Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find a way to help the Kethemori, even if it meant breaking some rules. He had always been good at finding connections others missed, and now he had access to the greatest biological database in the galaxy. If there was an answer out there, he was determined to find it. As he stared out at the stars, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was just a human teenager, barely old enough to be on the station. But sometimes, he thought, being young meant being willing to try things that older, more experienced minds had dismissed as impossible. The fate of an entire species might depend on whether a 17-year-old from Earth could see patterns that the galaxy's greatest scientific minds had missed. Marcus spent the next morning in the station's vast biological database, officially researching for his xenobiology assignment, but secretly looking for anything that might help the Kethemori. The database contained information on over 10,000 known species, their evolutionary histories, and their biological adaptations. It was overwhelming, but Marcus had learned to be methodical from his parents, both research scientists back on Earth. He started by studying the Kethemori themselves. They were humanoid, but with distinctive features: elongated skulls, four-chambered hearts, and most importantly, a unique genetic structure that made them incredibly efficient at processing certain minerals found on their homeworld. This same genetic efficiency was now killing them, as the disease exploited their specialized cellular pathways. The more Marcus read, the more frustrated he became. Every medical report reached the same conclusion. The disease was too specifically targeted to the Kethemori genetic code. Their immune systems weren't just failing to fight it off, they were actively helping it spread throughout their bodies. During lunch, Marcus sat with his usual group of friends. Zara's crystalline form was dimmer than usual, reflecting her mood. Thok barely touched his food, which was unusual for the normally hungry Ursoid. Even the cheerful ZMAC students nearby seemed subdued. "Any news about the survivors?" Marcus asked. Thok's ears drooped. "My dormmate works in the medical bay as a translator. He says 3 more died yesterday. There are only 217 left." Marcus felt sick. At this rate, the entire species would be extinct within weeks. He thought about Earth's history, about all the diseases that had wiped out populations before vaccines and treatments were discovered. But humans had time to adapt, to find solutions. The Kethemori didn't have that luxury. After lunch, Marcus found himself wandering the station's corridors, lost in thought. He ended up in the observation lounge, staring out at a nearby nebula whose swirling colors reminded him of the aurora borealis he'd seen during a family trip to Alaska. That's when he overheard a conversation that changed everything. 2 graduate students, a Meridian and a Helix, were discussing their thesis projects near the viewport. The Meridian was studying symbiotic relationships between different species, while the Helix was researching genetic adaptation in extreme environments. "The fascinating thing," the Meridian was saying, "is how some species have learned to use genetic incompatibility as a defense mechanism. They actually encourage beneficial mutations that make them unsuitable hosts for specific pathogens." Marcus's head snapped up. Genetic incompatibility as defense. He thought about Earth's sickle cell anemia, a genetic condition that was harmful in many ways but provided resistance to malaria. What if the solution wasn't to cure the Kethemori's genetic efficiency, but to give them a beneficial incompatibility? He rushed back to the database and began searching with new parameters. Instead of looking for species similar to the Kethmori, he searched for species that had survived genetic diseases through adaptation rather than treatment. The results were limited but promising. The Vorthak of the spiral arm had survived a similar genetic plague 3,000 years ago, but their solution involved a complete metabolic shift that took generations. The crystal beings of Tau City had encountered something comparable, but their silicon-based biology made their solutions irrelevant to carbon-based life. Then Marcus found something interesting. The Nilith were a species that lived in the radiation-soaked asteroid fields of the Gamma sector. Their unique adaptation was the ability to rapidly shift their genetic expression in response to environmental threats. They could essentially turn off vulnerable genetic pathways when under attack. Marcus's hands trembled as he read the research. The Nilith didn't prevent genetic diseases. They became temporarily incompatible with them. It was like changing the locks on your house while the burglar was trying to break in. But there was a problem. The Nilith adaptation process required exposure to specific types of cosmic radiation found only in their home system. The radiation triggered genetic switches that couldn't be activated any other way. At least that's what the research claimed. Marcus leaned back in his chair, thinking hard. The research was 60 years old. Technology had advanced significantly since then. Maybe there were new ways to trigger those same genetic switches without the dangerous radiation. He was so absorbed in his research that he didn't notice Dr. Veltar approaching until her tentacle gently touched his shoulder. "Young Marcus," she said in her melodious voice, "you have been here for 7 hours. The database logs show you have accessed over 3,000 research files today. Perhaps you should rest." Marcus looked up at his professor, torn between excitement and uncertainty. Dr. Veltar, hypothetically speaking, if someone wanted to artificially trigger genetic adaptation switches like the ones the Nilith possess, would that be possible with current technology? The Aquarian's large eyes studied him carefully. That is a very specific hypothetical question. "May I ask what has prompted such unusual curiosity?" Marcus made a decision. "I think I might have found a way to help the Kethmori. Not cure them exactly, but maybe give them a way to survive." Dr. Veltar's tentacles rippled, and what Marcus had learned was the equivalent of raised eyebrows. That is a bold claim for a first-year student. "Tell me more." Marcus explained his research about genetic incompatibility and the Nilith adaptation process. Dr. Veltar listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on her tablet. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Your reasoning is sound," she finally said. "But there are significant challenges. First, we would need to understand exactly how Nilith genetic switches work. Second, we would need to find a way to trigger them in a completely different species. Third, we would need to do all of this without killing the patients in the process." "But it's possible?" Marcus asked eagerly. "Theoretically, yes. But Marcus, you must understand. The station's medical team includes some of the galaxy's most brilliant minds. If this solution were viable, surely they would have considered it." Marcus felt his excitement deflate. But Dr. Veltar wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "sometimes fresh perspectives see possibilities that experienced minds dismiss too quickly. If you truly believe this approach has merit, you should present it to Dr. Nethera, but you must be prepared for skepticism and criticism." That evening, Marcus prepared a presentation on his research. He knew he was probably wrong. He knew the medical experts would likely dismiss his ideas. But he also knew that doing nothing meant watching an entire species die, while he had the knowledge and resources to at least try to help. As he worked late into the station's night cycle, Marcus thought about what his parents had always told him. Being smart wasn't about having all the answers, but about asking the right questions. Maybe his question about genetic incompatibility wasn't the answer the Kethmori needed, but maybe it would lead someone else to the real solution. Either way, he had to try. The alternative was unthinkable. The next morning, Marcus stood outside the medical bay's main office, his presentation tablet clutched in sweaty palms. Dr. Veltar had arranged a meeting with Dr. Nethera, but Marcus was beginning to doubt himself. What if his idea was completely wrong? What if he was wasting precious time that could be spent on real solutions? Dr. Nethera was a helix, one of the most analytically gifted species in the galaxy. Her serpentine body was covered in scales that shifted color based on her mental state, currently a deep blue that Marcus's cultural database told him indicated exhaustion and stress. Her 3 eyes examined him with the kind of intensity that made Marcus feel like a specimen under a microscope. Dr. Veltar tells me you have a theory about treating the Keth-Mori condition, she said without preamble. Her voice carried the slight hiss common to her species. I will be honest with you, young human. We have tried 47 different treatment approaches. We have consulted with medical experts from 18 different species. Time is running short, and I cannot afford to waste it on amateur speculation. Marcus felt his confidence crumble, but he forced himself to speak. I understand, Dr. Nithara, but what if we're approaching this wrong? What if instead of trying to cure the disease, we make the Keth-Mori temporarily incompatible with it? The scales on Dr. Nithara's neck shifted to a skeptical yellow. Incompatible? Explain. Marcus activated his presentation, his hands shaking slightly. The holographic display showed the Nalith genetic structure alongside the Keth-Mori genome. The Nalith have adaptive genetic switches that let them become temporarily incompatible with threats targeting their specific genetic markers. If we could artificially trigger similar switches in the Keth-Mori, the disease might not be able to recognize them as valid hosts. Dr. Nithara studied the data, her scales shifting through several colors as she processed the information. The Nalith adaptation requires cosmic radiation exposure. The process would kill the Keth-Mori long before any beneficial effects occurred. But that was 60 years ago, Marcus said eagerly. What if we could trigger the same genetic switches using modern medical technology? Targeted electromagnetic fields, controlled genetic therapy, maybe even nanotechnology. For the first time, Dr. Nithara's scales showed a hint of green, which Marcus hoped meant interest. Show me your comparative analysis of the genetic pathways. Marcus had spent most of the night creating detailed charts comparing Keth-Mori and Nalith genetic structures. He highlighted the specific gene sequences that controlled adaptation responses and showed how they might be modified to respond to artificial triggers instead of radiation. This is actually quite thorough, Dr. Nithara admitted, her scales now showing bands of green and blue. Your theoretical framework has merit, but implementation would be extraordinarily complex and dangerous. More dangerous than certain extinction? Marcus asked quietly. Dr. Nithara's scales went completely still, a sign Marcus recognized as deep thought. After several minutes, she spoke again. I will need to consult with my team, but first I want you to meet someone. She led Marcus through the medical bay's sterile corridors to an observation room overlooking the quarantine ward. Through the reinforced transparent barrier, Marcus could see the remaining Keth-Mori survivors. They were humanoid but taller than humans, with elongated skulls and skin that had a subtle metallic sheen. Many were visibly ill, their movements weak and labored. Their average age is 43 Earth years, Dr. Nithara said softly. They are scientists, artists, parents, children. Each one represents irreplaceable knowledge and culture, and we are losing them at a rate of 5 to 7 per day. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier on his shoulders. These weren't just research subjects or theoretical problems. They were people. An entire civilization reduced to fewer than 200 individuals. There, Dr. Nithara said, pointing to a figure near the center of the ward. That is Kethavar Nomthol, their senior scientist. He has been helping us understand their biology, but he is also one of the sickest. If your theory has any chance of working, we would need to test it soon. As if sensing their observation, Kethvar looked up toward the viewing window. Even through the barrier and across the distance, Marcus could see the intelligence in his large, dark eyes. The Keth-Mori raised one long-fingered hand in what might have been a greeting or a farewell. He knows they're dying, Marcus said. They all do. But they continue to help us, hoping we might find something that could save their children or the few healthy individuals remaining. Dr. Nithara's scales shifted to a somber purple. Your idea is creative, Marcus, but the risks are enormous. We would essentially be conducting experimental surgery on beings who are already critically ill. Marcus thought about everything he'd learned at the station about cooperation between species, about the courage it took to try new approaches to old problems. What if we started with computer simulations? Model the process thoroughly before attempting any actual procedures? That would take weeks we don't have. Then what if we ask them? Marcus said suddenly. The Keth-Mori, I mean. Shouldn't they have a say in whether we try an experimental treatment? Dr. Nithara studied him with all three eyes. You would be willing to explain your theory to a dying species and ask them to volunteer for an untested procedure? Marcus felt scared, but he nodded. If it were my species, I'd want to know about every possible option, no matter how risky. Very well, Dr. Nithara decided. But first, you will work with my team to refine your proposal. If we're going to ask the Kethmori to risk their lives on your theory, we need to give them the best possible version of it. Over the next 3 days, Marcus found himself working 18-hour shifts alongside the galaxy's most brilliant medical minds. Dr. Lyank, a crystalline whose computational abilities far exceeded any computer, ran thousands of genetic simulations. Dr. Forth, an Aquarian engineer, designed theoretical devices that could trigger genetic switches without harmful radiation. Dr. Yathara, a photonic being who existed as pure energy, provided insights into electromagnetic field manipulation. Marcus learned more about advanced genetics and medical technology in those 3 days than in his entire previous education. But more importantly, he learned about the incredible determination that drove these beings to work without rest to save a species they'd never met before the crisis began. His human perspective proved valuable in unexpected ways. While the alien doctors focused on complex technological solutions, Marcus kept asking simpler questions that led to breakthrough insights. When Dr. Lyank's simulation showed a 97% failure rate, Marcus suggested modifying the timing of the treatment. When Dr. Forth's devices proved too complex to build quickly, Marcus proposed using existing medical equipment in new combinations. Finally, they had a proposal that might actually work. The risks were still enormous. They estimated a 60% chance of success, with a 30% chance of accelerating the patient's deaths. But it was better odds than the Kethmori had otherwise. Now came the hardest part, asking a dying species to trust a 17-year-old human with their last hope for survival. The meeting took place in the quarantine ward's main chamber, with Marcus and Dr. Nithara speaking through the communication system, while the remaining Kethmori gathered around their elder, Kethvar Numthul. Marcus had practiced his explanation dozens of times, but seeing the faces of the dying beings made his prepared words seem inadequate. Kethvar was clearly the sickest among them, his metallic skin dulled to an unhealthy gray and his movement slow and deliberate, but his voice remained strong as he spoke through the translator. Young human, Dr. Nithara has told us you may have found a path to survival for our people. We are grateful that beings we have never met would work so hard to save us. Please tell us what you have discovered. Marcus took a deep breath and began explaining his theory about genetic incompatibility. He used simple terms, avoiding technical jargon, and drew comparisons to natural adaptation processes found throughout the galaxy. The Kethmori listened with the intense focus of scientists, occasionally asking questions that revealed their deep understanding of their own biology. So you propose to make us temporarily not Kethmori, Kethvar said when Marcus finished. To change our genetic markers so the disease no longer recognizes us as suitable hosts. Exactly, Marcus said. The changes would be reversible once the disease is eliminated from your systems. You would still be yourselves, just with modified genetic expressions. A younger Kethmori named Velthan stepped forward. What are the risks? Dr. Nithara answered this time. We estimate a 60% chance of success, meaning the treatment stops the disease progression. 30% chance of accelerated death due to treatment complications, 10% chance of unpredictable results. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of impossible choices. Finally, Kethvar spoke again. If we do nothing, how long do we have? Based on current progression rates, 2 to 3 weeks for most individuals, Dr. Nithara replied honestly. Kethvar looked around at his people, seeing something in their faces that Marcus couldn't interpret. We will discuss this among ourselves. But first, young Marcus, may we ask you something? Of course. Why does a human child risk his reputation and standing to save a species he has never encountered before today? Marcus felt all eyes on him, not just the Kethmori, but Dr. Nithara and the other medical staff. He thought about all the easy answers he could give about scientific curiosity or galactic cooperation. But these people deserved honesty, because back on Earth we have a saying, science advances one funeral at a time. It means old ideas have to die before new ones can flourish. But it also means that every time we lose knowledge and culture, the universe becomes a smaller, poorer place. Marcus looked directly at Kethvar. Your species has existed for millions of years. You've created art and music and scientific discoveries that no one else in the galaxy has imagined. If you die, all of that dies with you, and that's unacceptable. Kethavar's large eyes seemed to shine brighter. You speak of us as if we matter to the universe. You do matter, Marcus said firmly. Every species matters. Every individual matters. That's what I've learned here at the station. That diversity makes us all stronger, and losing any part of it makes us all weaker. The Keth-Mori spent 6 hours in discussion. Marcus waited in the observation room, watching as they debated in their musical language. Some seemed angry. Others appeared resigned, and a few looked hopeful. Dr. Nithara sat beside him, her scales cycling through colors that reflected her own anxiety. Do you think they'll agree? Marcus asked. I don't know, she admitted. They are asking us to trust them with an untested treatment created by a student who has been studying xenobiology for less than 2 months. From their perspective, it might seem like desperation rather than science. But Marcus watched Kethvar during the discussions and saw something else in the elder's expression. Not desperation, but the same curiosity that had driven Marcus to search through thousands of research files. The Keth-Mori were scientists too, and scientists understood that sometimes you had to take calculated risks to make discoveries. Finally, Kethvar approached the communication panel. We have decided, he announced. 47 of our number volunteered to undergo the experimental treatment. We understand the risks, but we also understand that doing nothing guarantees our extinction. Dr. Nithara's scales shifted to surprised orange. 47? That's nearly a quarter of your survivors. We are scientists, Dr. Nithara. We understand the value of adequate sample sizes for experimental procedures. If Marcus's theory works for some of us but not others, we need enough volunteers to understand why and how to improve the treatment for the rest. Marcus felt simultaneously elated and terrified. They were actually going to try his idea, but the weight of 47 lives now rested on a theory he'd developed in less than a week. The preparation took another 2 days. The medical team worked around the clock to modify existing equipment and prepare the treatment chambers. Marcus found himself consulting on technical details he barely understood, but his insights continued to prove valuable. His suggestion to stagger the treatments over several hours allowed them to learn from each procedure and adjust the next one accordingly. The night before the first treatment, Marcus couldn't sleep. He wandered the station's corridors, eventually finding himself back in the observation deck where this whole journey had begun. Zara found him there, her crystalline form casting rainbow patterns on the walls. You look worried. Friend Marcus, she chimed. 47 people are going to risk their lives tomorrow based on an idea I had. What if I'm wrong? What if the treatment kills them faster than the disease would have? Zara's light patterns shifted to soothing blues and greens. On my homeworld, we have a saying. The crystal that remains buried never learns to refract light. Sometimes you must emerge from safety to discover what you're truly capable of. Thok joined them, moving with unusual quietness for such a large being. My people believe that courage is not the absence of fear, but acting despite fear. You've shown more courage than most adults I know. Marcus appreciated his friend's support, but the fear remained. Tomorrow they would learn whether his theory could save the Keth-Mori or simply become another tragic footnote in their extinction. As he finally headed back to his dormitory, Marcus passed the medical bay and saw lights still burning in the preparation rooms. Dr. Nithara and her team were still working, refining procedures and double-checking equipment. They shared his fears, but they also shared his determination to try everything possible to save the Keth-Mori. Marcus fell asleep thinking about Kethvar's words. We understand that doing nothing guarantees our extinction. Sometimes the greatest risk was refusing to take any risks at all. The treatment began at 800 station time. Marcus stood in the observation room alongside Dr. Veltar and several other faculty members, watching as the first volunteer, a young Keth-Mori named Sothvel, was prepared for the procedure. The modified medical chamber looked like something from a science fiction movie, surrounded by electromagnetic field generators and genetic monitoring equipment. Dr. Nithara moved with precise efficiency, her scales showing the steady purple of focused concentration. The treatment itself was surprisingly quiet. No dramatic flashes of light or ominous humming, just the soft beeping of monitors and the whisper of air circulation systems. Initiating genetic field modulation, Dr. Forth announced from his console. The Aquarian engineer's tentacles danced across multiple control surfaces simultaneously. Cellular response is within normal parameters. Marcus held his breath as they watched Sothvel's vital signs on the monitors. The Kethmori's genetic markers began shifting as the artificial triggers took effect, slowly changing the expression patterns that made him vulnerable to the disease. It was like watching evolution happen in real time. Genetic incompatibility threshold reached, Dr. Lyank reported, her crystalline structure glowing brighter as she processed vast amounts of data. The subject's cells are no longer presenting the target markers the disease requires for attachment. After 2 hours, they moved Sothvel to a recovery chamber. His vital signs were stable, and early tests suggested the treatment was working. But they wouldn't know for certain until they could test whether the disease could still infect his modified cells. The second volunteer was Kethvar himself. Despite being the sickest of all the survivors, he had insisted on being among the early test subjects. If this treatment fails, he had told them, at least it will fail on someone who would have died soon anyway. Marcus watched nervously as the elder Kethmori underwent the same procedure. Kethvar's weakened condition made the process more dangerous, and several times his vital signs fluctuated wildly. But Dr. Nithara and her team adjusted the treatment in real time, using lessons learned from the first procedure. By the end of the first day, they had successfully treated 12 volunteers. All were stable, and genetic tests confirmed that their cellular structures had been successfully modified. But the real test would come when they exposed sample cells to the disease itself. That night, Marcus barely slept. He kept thinking about Kethvar's calm expression as he underwent the treatment, trusting a human teenager's theory with his life. The responsibility was overwhelming, but Marcus forced himself to focus on the positive results so far. The next morning brought the moment of truth. Dr. Lyank had prepared isolated cell samples from each treated volunteer and exposed them to the same disease that had killed billions of Kethmori. Marcus stood with the medical team as they waited for the results. Sample 1. No disease attachment, Dr. Lyank announced. Sample 2, no attachment. Sample 3. She paused, checking her readings. Also negative for disease attachment. One by one, the results came back negative. The modified Kethmori cells were completely resistant to the disease. Marcus felt tears of relief running down his cheeks as the final test confirmed what they had hoped. The treatment was working. But their celebration was interrupted by an alarm from the recovery ward. One of the volunteers, a middle-aged Kethmori named Thulman, was experiencing complications. His genetic modifications were reversing themselves faster than expected, and the disease was beginning to re-establish itself in his system. Dr. Nithara's scales flashed urgent red as she rushed to examine the patient. His immune system is fighting the genetic modifications. We need to stabilize the changes or the treatment will fail. Marcus found himself thinking frantically, why would some individuals' genetics remain stable while others reverted? He thought about human biology, about the way some people responded differently to medications based on their individual genetic variations. What if it's not a failure? Marcus said suddenly. What if it's an adaptation issue? Some individuals might need different trigger frequencies or treatment durations. Dr. Forth's tentacles paused over his controls. You're suggesting we customize the treatment for each individual's genetic profile? Exactly, Marcus said. The Nalith probably developed individual variations in their adaptation responses over thousands of years. We're trying to replicate that process in hours. Maybe we need to fine-tune the approach for each person. Dr. Nithara considered this quickly. It would mean starting over with our remaining volunteers, creating personalized treatment protocols for each individual. But it might mean saving everyone, Marcus pointed out. They spent the next day analyzing the genetic profiles of all the volunteers, looking for patterns that might explain why some responded better than others. Marcus worked alongside Dr. Lyank, learning to interpret the complex genetic data that scrolled across her crystalline displays. The pattern, when they found it, was elegant in its simplicity. The Kethmori who maintained stable genetic modifications had slight variations in their adaptation gene sequences, variations that occurred naturally in about 30% of their population. These individuals needed longer treatment periods but achieved more stable results. The other 70% needed shorter, more intense treatments with specific electromagnetic frequencies tailored to their genetic markers. It was like tuning a musical instrument. Each individual required a slightly different approach to achieve harmony. Armed with this knowledge, they resumed treatments with the remaining volunteers. This time, each procedure was customized based on the individual's genetic profile. The results were dramatically better. Stable modifications that showed no signs of reverting, complete resistance to the disease, and minimal side effects. Marcus watched as volunteer after volunteer emerged from treatment successfully. Kethavar, despite his initial complications, responded well to the revised approach. His color improved noticeably within hours, and his strength began returning as his body was no longer fighting a losing battle against the disease. By the end of the 4th day, all 47 volunteers had been successfully treated. More importantly, they had developed protocols that could be applied to the remaining survivors. The treatment that had started as Marcus's desperate theory was becoming a proven medical procedure. But the real test came when they began treating the youngest Kethmori, the children whose immune systems were still developing. Marcus found himself especially invested in their success. They represented not just the survival of the species, but its future. The first child, a 7-year-old named Lethsia, underwent treatment with her parents watching anxiously through the observation window. Marcus stood with them, feeling every parent's fear magnified by his own sense of responsibility. Treatment complete, Dr. Nithara announced after what felt like hours. Genetic modification stable, vital signs strong, disease resistance confirmed. As Lethsia sat up in the recovery chamber, looking around with bright, curious eyes, Marcus realized they had achieved something extraordinary. They hadn't just saved individuals, they had saved a future. These children would grow up, have children of their own, and carry their species' knowledge and culture forward into the galaxy's future. The success with the children gave them confidence to treat the remaining adult survivors. Within a week, every living Kethmori had undergone the genetic modification procedure. Not all of them survived. Some were too sick when treatment began. But the vast majority emerged healthy and disease-free. Marcus stood in the observation deck, watching the recovered Kethmori interact with their families for the first time in weeks without fear of contagion. Children played while adults discussed plans for rebuilding their civilization. It was the most beautiful sight Marcus had ever seen. 3 weeks after the final treatment, the Kethmori survivors were declared completely free of the disease. The quarantine was lifted, and for the first time since their arrival at Kepler Station, they could interact freely with other species. Marcus watched from the main observation deck as Kethavar and his people stepped out of the medical bay and into the station's central plaza. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Species from across the galaxy had heard about the Kethmori, crisis in the experimental treatment that saved them. Representatives from dozens of worlds crowded around the survivors, offering condolences for their losses and congratulations for their survival. Marcus tried to stay in the background, but Kethavar spotted him in the crowd and made his way over with determined steps. The elderly Kethmori's color had fully returned, his metallic skin now gleaming with health, and his movements were strong and purposeful. "Young Marcus," Kethavar said, placing a long-fingered hand on Marcus's shoulder. "My people and I owe you a debt that can never be repaid." "You don't owe me anything," Marcus replied, feeling embarrassed by the attention. "Dr. Nithara and her team did all the real work. I just had an idea." "Ideas change the universe," Kethavar said solemnly. "And your idea saved mine." Word of the successful treatment spread rapidly throughout the galactic community. Medical researchers from hundreds of worlds requested detailed information about the genetic modification process. The technique Marcus had theorized was being adapted for use against other species-specific diseases, potentially saving countless lives across the galaxy. But with fame came complications Marcus hadn't expected. Media representatives wanted interviews. Scientists requested him to speak at conferences. Government officials from various worlds tried to recruit him for their research programs. The quiet student who had just wanted to help was suddenly one of the most famous beings in the galaxy. Dr. Veltar found him hiding in the xenobiology lab one evening, overwhelmed by the constant attention. "Fame is a burden you did not seek," she observed, her tentacles rippling with sympathy. "But it is also an opportunity to influence how your discovery is used." "I don't want to be famous," Marcus said miserably. "I just wanted to help the Kethmori." Now everyone expects me to have solutions to every problem in the galaxy. Perhaps that is not such a terrible expectation, Dr. Veltar suggested gently. You have demonstrated that fresh perspectives can solve problems that expertise alone cannot. The galaxy needs minds like yours. Marcus considered this as he watched other students working on their assignments, normal teenagers dealing with normal academic challenges. Part of him envied their simplicity, but another part realized that Dr. Veltar was right. He had been given an extraordinary opportunity to make a difference. The Kethmori themselves were facing their own challenges. With only 163 survivors, they had to completely rethink how to preserve and continue their civilization. They had lost most of their population, their homeworld was uninhabitable, and they needed to find a new place to rebuild. Marcus found himself drawn into these discussions, not as a medical consultant, but as someone who had invested deeply in their survival. The Kethmori had asked him to help them plan for their future, recognizing that the human teenager who had saved their lives might also have insights into how they could rebuild their society. We have knowledge from 12 billion minds, Kethvar explained during one of their planning sessions, but we have only 163 bodies to carry that knowledge forward. We must find ways to preserve and share what we know, while also adapting to our new reality. Marcus thought about Earth's own history of disaster recovery and population bottlenecks. Maybe the answer isn't to try to maintain everything exactly as it was, he suggested. Maybe this is an opportunity to create something new that combines the best of your traditional culture with adaptations for your new circumstances. The discussion that followed was fascinating. The Kethmori began talking about using advanced technology to preserve their cultural knowledge while developing new social structures adapted to their small population. They spoke of creating genetic diversity through careful family planning and establishing multiple colonies to prevent future extinction events. Marcus realized he was witnessing the birth of a new kind of civilization, one that had faced extinction and emerged with a deeper understanding of both fragility and resilience. Several months later, the Galactic Council offered the Kethmori a choice of 3 uninhabited worlds suitable for colonization. Marcus was invited to join the survey expedition that would help them choose their new home. It was an honor typically reserved for senior diplomats and scientists, but the Kethmori had specifically requested his participation. The first world they visited was a lush planet with vast oceans and continents covered in vegetation. It was beautiful but lacked the mineral resources the Kethmori needed for their advanced technology. The second world had abundant resources, but a harsh climate that would require significant technological adaptation. The Kethmori could survive there, but it would be a constant struggle. The third world surprised everyone. It was smaller than the others with unusual atmospheric conditions that most species would find challenging. But when the Kethmori survey team analyzed its composition, they became visibly excited. The atmospheric, density and mineral composition are almost identical to our original homeworld, Belton explained to Marcus as they stood on the planet's surface. But the gravitational field has unique properties that might actually enhance our genetic stability. Marcus looked around at the alien landscape, seeing it through Kethmori eyes. To them, this wasn't a challenging environment, but a perfect opportunity to rebuild their civilization in conditions that might make them stronger than they had ever been before. This is where we will make our new home, Kethvar announced. We will call it Kethmoravel, Kethmori Reborn. As they prepared to leave the station and establish their new colony, the Kethmori held a ceremony to honor those who had helped them survive. Marcus found himself standing before the entire survivor population, as Kethvar presented him with a crystal pendant containing a genetic sample from every survivor. "This is our gift to you," Kethvar said. "As long as this crystal exists, the Kethmori will never truly be extinct. You carry within it the genetic heritage of our entire species." Marcus felt the weight of the crystal around his neck, understanding that it represented not just survival, but responsibility. He was now literally carrying the future of an entire species. But as he looked around at the healthy, hopeful faces of the Kethmori survivors, Marcus realized that the real gift was simpler than that. He had learned that one person, regardless of age or experience, could make a difference that rippled across the entire galaxy. He had learned that courage wasn't about being fearless, but about acting despite fear. Most importantly, he had learned that in a universe full of diverse life forms, the most valuable skill was the ability to see connections that others missed. The Kethemori weren't just survivors now. They were pioneers, ready to build a new civilization that would be stronger and more resilient than the one they had lost. And Marcus had played a part in making that future possible. 5 years later, Marcus stood on the observation deck of the research vessel Harmony, watching as Kethmoravel grew larger in the viewport. The planet that had seemed so alien and challenging during their first survey was now home to a thriving Kethmori colony. Cities of gleaming metal and crystal dotted the continents, and orbital stations sparkled like jewels around the planet. Marcus was no longer the nervous 17-year-old who had stumbled upon a solution to save a dying species. At 22, he was Dr. Marcus Chen, holder of degrees in xenobiology and interspecies medicine, and director of the Galactic Medical Innovation Institute. But more importantly to him, he was still the friend who had promised to visit the Kethmori in their new home. The shuttle trip down to the planet's surface gave Marcus his first close look at how the Kethmori had adapted to their new world. Their cities were unlike anything built by any other species, structures that seemed to grow organically from the planet's unique crystalline bedrock, powered by the same atmospheric energy that had made the world so appealing to them. Kethavar met him at the spaceport, and Marcus was amazed by the change in his old friend. The elderly Kethemori not only looked healthy but seemed somehow more vibrant than he had even before the plague. His metallic skin had taken on new patterns that Marcus learned indicated enhanced genetic stability. "Welcome to our new home, my friend," Kethvar said, embracing Marcus in the traditional Kethmori greeting. "Come, there is much I want to show you." The tour of New Keththara, the colony's capital city, was astounding. The Kethemori hadn't simply rebuilt their old civilization. They had created something entirely new. Buildings that could reconfigure themselves based on need, transportation systems that used the planet's natural energy fields, and most impressively, genetic laboratories where they were working to ensure their species would never again be vulnerable to extinction. "We have learned from our tragedy," Kethvar explained as they visited the Central Genetic Archive. "Never again will the Kethmori exist as a single population on a single world. We are establishing colonies on 12 different planets, each adapted to different environmental conditions." Marcus was shown the colony ships being prepared for departure, each one carrying carefully selected groups of colonists and complete genetic archives. The Kethemori were ensuring that even if disaster struck one colony, the others would survive and continue the species. But the most remarkable development was in the children. Marcus met dozens of young Kethmori who had been born on Kethmoravel, and he was amazed by their adaptations. The planet's unique environment had triggered new expressions in their genetic code, making them even more resilient than their parents. "They are the first of a new kind of Kethmori," Velthan explained. She had become the colony's chief geneticist and was leading research into how the planetary environment was affecting their evolution. "They maintain all the knowledge and culture of our ancestors, but they are adapted for survival in ways we never imagined possible." Marcus spent a week learning about these developments, but the most meaningful moment came when he visited the Memorial Gardens. At the center of the vast park stood a crystal monument containing the names of all 12 billion Kethmori who had died in the plague. But surrounding it were smaller crystals representing the new lives born on Kethmoravel, already numbering in the thousands. "We do not forget our loss," Kethvar said as they stood before the memorial, "but we also celebrate our future. The children playing in these gardens will grow up knowing that their species survived because beings from across the galaxy cared enough to help us." During his stay, Marcus also learned about the broader impact of the genetic modification technique he had theorized. Medical teams throughout the galaxy were using adapted versions of the treatment to combat other species-specific diseases. The Helix had used it to overcome a genetic disorder that had plagued them for centuries. The crystalline beings had adapted it to repair damage from industrial radiation. Even humans were benefiting from research inspired by Marcus's original idea. "You started something larger than you realized," Dr. Nithara told him during a video call from her new position as head of Galactic Medical Research. The principle of induced genetic incompatibility has opened entirely new fields of medicine. We estimate that treatments based on your theory have saved over 50 million lives across 37 different species. But Marcus was most proud of what he saw in the Kethmori themselves. They had taken their survival as a responsibility to help others avoid the same fate. Kethmori medical researchers were working with dozens of species to develop early warning systems for genetic diseases. They were sharing their hard-won knowledge about population survival and genetic diversity. On his final day on Kethmori, Marcus attended a ceremony at the Academy of Future Sciences, where the most promising young Kethmori scientists received their training. To his surprise, the ceremony was dedicated to him. "Today we honor not just a friend," Kethvar announced to the assembled students, "but a reminder that wisdom and courage can come from unexpected sources. Dr. Marcus Chen was younger than many of you when he chose to risk his reputation to save a species he had never encountered. He reminds us that in science, as in life, fresh perspectives often see solutions that experience has overlooked." Marcus was invited to address the students, and he found himself looking out at dozens of young Kethmori faces filled with curiosity and determination. These children existed because of a theory he had developed 5 years ago, but they would grow up to make discoveries that would benefit the entire galaxy. "The most important thing I learned from helping your people," Marcus told them, "is that science isn't just about understanding how things work. It's about understanding how we can work together to solve problems that seem impossible when faced alone." As Marcus prepared to leave Kethmori, Kethvar presented him with a final gift, a seed from the tree of memory that grew at the heart of every Kethmori settlement. "Plant this on Earth," Kethvar said. "Let it remind your people that sometimes the greatest discoveries come not from laboratories or universities, but from young minds willing to ask new questions about old problems." The journey back to Earth gave Marcus time to reflect on everything that had happened since that first day when he had noticed unusual activity in the docking bays. He thought about the chain of events that had led from a curious teenager's question to the survival of an entire species and the development of medical techniques that were saving lives throughout the galaxy. But mostly, he thought about the responsibility that came with knowledge and opportunity. The galaxy was vast and full of challenges that required fresh thinking and the courage to try unconventional solutions. As one of the youngest directors in the history of the Galactic Medical Institute, Marcus knew he would face many more problems that seemed impossible to solve, but he also knew something that his younger self hadn't understood 5 years ago. Impossible problems often had solutions hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone willing to look at them from a new angle. The key was not being afraid to ask questions that others had dismissed as too simple or too complicated. As Earth appeared in the viewport, growing from a distant star to the blue marble he remembered from his first trip to space, Marcus held the Kethmori memory seed in his hands. He would plant it in the garden at the Galactic Medical Institute's Earth headquarters, where future students would see it and perhaps be inspired to ask their own impossible questions. The human teen who had saved a species was gone, replaced by a man who understood that saving one species was just the beginning. The galaxy was full of life forms facing challenges that would require cooperation, creativity, and the courage to believe that no problem was truly impossible if enough minds worked together to solve it. Marcus smiled as he thought about all the young scientists currently studying at stations and academies throughout the galaxy, each one potentially carrying the next great discovery in their curious minds. The future had never looked brighter.